again, welcome to the Clarkdale Historical Society Museum, first Friday in their own words. We are so very privileged today to have Mary Beal Bercham here, otherwise known as Mary Starkey, who grew up here in Clarkdale. Her mom and dad and her whole family have a lot of deep roots in the Verde Valley, and she's got a great presentation for us this morning. So, one more announcement is be sure to come next month on the first Friday. We're going to have a presentation on the history of radio in the Verde Valley that goes all the way back to the 1930s. So, with that, I will introduce Mary. Come on up.
It's about people. And we grew up in a great place. It's wonderful here. We know that. But it's all about who we were and all the people that we... Nancy Ash. Hello. So anyway, I'm going to get started because I can be real wordy and talk a lot. So anyway, this is the history of my family. The Wombachers, the Allens, the Starkeys. But there are also all these other people that I'm related to. The Wingfields, the Reeves. I mean, it just goes on and on. So at one point, every business on Main Street, with the exception, I think, Selna's, was run or owned by somebody in our family. And your dad was the manager of the Bank of Arizona right there. And your mom worked there, my sister. And then Joe Wombacher owned the newsstand. And then next to him, I don't know who the barbershop guy was. Anybody remember the barbershop man? I can't remember him. You can't hear me? Well, okay. All right. Anybody remember the name of the barbershop owner? I don't remember that. Curtis, you remember? That was it? And then next door to them, do you remember the jewelry store? And do you remember Viva and Orpha? Orpha Wilson owned the beauty shop? You remember, okay, there's names. Anybody remember Viva Sprague? Linda Sprague was her daughter. She was in high school with many of us. And then there was the Rexall. The Harris owned the Rexall, or before it became Rexall, they owned. What? Anyway, then there was the movie theater. And my sister Jane ran the movie theater, popped popcorn and did all that stuff. And then next to the movie theater was the laundromat, and it was the Jones Furniture Store long before the laundromat. Dinah, we know, don't we? So those were all people, and across the street was the Texaco. Dan Wombacher ran the Texaco. Norma Wombacher had the Snowcap, but the Snowcap came long after all of that. And I think, well, I wasn't related to the Peckridges, but the 1012 was quite a while after that. And then the Black Hills Restaurant. So that was it. And there were some real interesting things that went on during that time that I'm going to cover in my story. But we're going to go back to where these people started. And Fred, you want to pull up this was the family. They were gathering to leave, and this was in 1880. And they decided that they were coming west. And the story I was told, they were coming west to drive their horses here because they were running out of water where they lived. So this was the farewell goodbye party for those people who were the Allens, and these are the folks that decided that they were going to come live here. So this is where it all started. So the family had been busy for weeks preparing for the big day. Not everyone was happy about leaving Bloomington, Illinois. Friends and other family members helped pack the wagon. The oxen had been yoked. The dog, cat, and chickens were also loaded. Their other wagon was packed with clothes, food staples, bedding, and a few pieces of furniture, cooking utensils, medicine, tools, and Grandpa's rifle. Kate Sessions Allen, my maternal grandmother, great-grandmother actually, and her parents, Nancy and George Sessions. They were heading west. Grandma said they were driving their horses west. They arrived in Camp Verde in 1876 after an arduous journey through Kansas, New Mexico, and part of Arizona. And I'm not sure why they decided to stay in Camp Verde. But eventually they resettled in Cherry, starting a stage stop that served wagon trains and cavalry that were coming and going between the railhead over the mountain in Dewey, Arizona. Each child had a chore, and hers was laundry, my grandma. Hers was laundry. She said she toiled many days scrubbing the trail-worn, dirty clothes of the tired travelers. During the Mescalero Apache Wars, she remembered Geronimo and his band of camped near their home, and apparently on the brink of starvation, the natives killed rats, squirrels, and other rodents, then dipped them by their tails into boiling vats of water to cook. They also gathered mesquite beans and acorns and watercress from nearby Cherry Creek. These stories were told to me by Anna Wombacher. Her name was Anna Josephine Allen Wombacher. She was my maternal grandmother, and she built the house that the Franqueros live in now. There they are. It's all about people, remember? There may be some incorrect dates because I couldn't actually verify some things, but this is to the best of my recollection. Grandma Wombacher was born in Cherry, Arizona in 1888. Her parents were William Riley Allen and Kate Sessions. She had 13 siblings. Some of the children who stayed in Arizona were Ethel Reeves of Camp Verde, Rose Black of Phoenix, Nina Dickinson Wickenburg, and her brothers George and Ray Allen of Clarkdale. I often spent the night with my grandparents in their small, simple, rustic home built out of reclaimed wood Grandpa gathered from the discarded trash at the smelter. It's your house. They slept in separate bedrooms, Grandma in the front of the house and Grandpa in the rear. She didn't have a bathroom close by. So her small room had this double bed, a chest of drawers, dressing table, and a mirror. There were a few personal items like Cornhusker's hand lotion, a tiny bottle of Campo Finique, hairbrush, and crocheted doilies. The only light in the dimly lit room hung from the ceiling. And if I had to pee in the night, she'd pull the chain on the light, reach under the bed, and pull out an empty Folgers coffee can for me to go pee. Grandma and Grandpa Wombacher had 2 daughters, Marie, the oldest, and Dorothy, my mother. Aunt Marie had 2 daughters, Carolyn and Frances, who stayed in the area. You may know Francie. She was married to Mick Ryan, who was our biology teacher. And then Carolyn was married to Lefty James, and they lived in what's now, I guess, the city hall right there in that house. And then they owned the laundromat at the inn by the park. And they had 4 daughters. Anyway, Carolyn and Francie were adopted by my grandparents when their mother died, Marie died. And I wonder who started calling Francie Francie, because I didn't know she was Frances. When Aunt Marie died from breast cancer, my grandparents adopted them. My mother became their half-sister as well as their aunt. Carolyn and Francie were close in age to my older sisters, Pat and Jane. I was born in 1947 in the UVX hospital in Jerome. Now, at the end of the presentation, I'm going to show you how much it costs to be born in Jerome and stay in the hospital for 10 days. My sister Jane and I are downwinders. We both had breast cancer caused from the radiation exposure from the A-bomb testing in Nevada. The prevailing wind blew the contaminated material over our area. We lived in Lower Town below the tracks. Our 2-bedroom house was close to my grandparents. It was easy for me to walk to their house. The neighborhood seemed enormous to me. I could play outside all day until Dad came home for dinner. Get ready, George. My friend Janice Benotz and her brother Larry, George, and I explored what we thought was a gargantuan world. However, our parents instilled in us fear and warned us not to go by the river or the railroad tracks because of the hobos. They might kidnap us. You know, I'm trying to envision now how Main Street looked in those years. Downtown Main Street, especially where my friends and classmates lived. The brick houses in Lower Town were like the ones in Upper Town, but with much less distinction then. However, I didn't pay attention to how everyone's house looked. They all looked the same to me. I guess it's because it's a company town. Robert Jackson, there you are. He's my classmate. There's Robert. Robert Jackson lived down there. Robert Dotson and Helen Davenport. They all lived in Lower Town, and he lived closer out between Clarkdale and Cottonwood. I was envious since they could easily walk to school. The Duncans lived a couple of blocks south of the school. Hello, Jim. Where are you? There you are. Thank you for raising your hand. Joe, their dad, ran the Alabama Freight Line, and I was talking I said, when I wrote this, my husband read it over, and he says, well, is it Alabama? And I went, no, it's called Alabama, right? Alabama Freight Lines. Dot was their mom, and Marvin, their older brother, was touted as the handsomest guy in school. Right? You know, Kathy, you've talked about how handsome he was. Wayne and Jimmy were my friends. The baseball field, now amazingly modernized, was on the left, and many nights we went to these Little League baseball games for my brother. I was more curious about the seemingly millions of bugs flying around the light poles and watching the bats dart about eating the bugs. And some nightbird would catch in on the act, too. The playground was just dirt. There were swings, a slide, monkey bars, teeter-totter, and a hopscotch game. See, it keeps popping. Do you hear the popping? Huh? If I put it close to my mouth, it pops. So how am I going to do this? Okay. It doesn't bother you? Okay. The playground was dirt, just dirt, blah, 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 blah. Some kids were bused from Upper Town and Jerome to the funky little bread basket-shaped bus that our janitor and bus driver, Nick Vladich, drove. Anybody remember Nick Vladich? He was a nice man. I'll never forget how the sawdust he used on the floor smelled, kind of oily, maybe linseed. He kept the floors impeccably clean and shiny, and we loved to slide on the slippery floor. On May Day, we made a little basket out of construction paper and knitting yarn. We'd fill it with juicy fruit gum and hang it on the classroom door, waiting for the blue fairy. The tension in the room was crazy, third graders eager to hear the blue fairy knock. It was a stampede as we rushed outside to hopefully get a glance of her. I usually walked home, down the hill, over the railroad tracks, past Evan Derrick's house, my grandparents, Gundy James, and finally home. Janice and Larry Bonatz lived across the road. Behind them, Mrs. Fain, Mrs. Akery, the Crosses, Bill, Helen, Billy, Jean, Linda, and Debbie. The other Derricks, Jim, Margaret, Maureen, Peggy, and Danny, the McCalls, and I can't remember who lived down there, but the guy who lived there owned the Purple Sage. Now, Donna said it was Rusty Veretto, right? That owned the Purple Sage? Was it Rusty Veretto? Do you remember? Rusty owned the Purple Sage. Okay, and his daughter was Rita, right? Didn't he have a daughter named Rita? The guy that lived in that house right there? Well, anyway, doesn't matter. I could never figure it out. Okay. Maybe. Okay, the area in front of their house, if you've ever driven down there and you go back on that area, there's a big wide open space in front of where the Derricks lived and the Crosses and all those people. Well, we would play ball there, and it was big enough for us to play ball. But after Christmas and after New Year's, everybody would gather their Christmas trees and bring them to that area, and we'd build a big bonfire and roast hot dogs and marshmallows. And the marshmallows were more fun than the hot dogs because we'd set them on fire and chase each other. None of us ever did things like that, did we? So anyway, cover that one. Everyone in our neighborhood brought their trees, and we all did our little trick down there, and it was a great time. And then I think in 1952, when the last molten material was poured down the black slag already built up from the years of dumping, it was still light when we'd jump in the car, cross over the bridge, and head up the road that runs along the Verde River to find a prime spot to view the event. Daddy would say, "Here comes the train, so keep your eyes on it." The little train would toot, come out of the building on the smelter, go along the top ridge of the slag, and then all of a sudden the bell would ring, ding! All of the slag would be dumped. And do you remember that? Yeah. It scared the crap out of me. Peck's Lake and Tavasi's Dairy and Irie's Ranch, now Dead Horse Ranch, were my favorite places to play. The 4th of July was the best time at the lake. The fireworks were set off from the ridge across the lake, and the reflection on the water was amazing. It sparkled from the explosion of all the colors. There were swings and lots of space to run, play ball, and other games before dark. It was a great time for a kid in Clarkdale. Tavasi's Dairy, John was my buddy. Devosse's Dairy was my Disneyland. Johnny and I were sidekicks. We roamed and explored every inch of the dairy, the barn, pasteurizing room, Grandma Devosse's kitchen. Nothing went unexplored by us. Okay, you're going to kick me in the butt for telling on this one. One time, Johnny got his tongue stuck when he licked the freezing slush of milk cascading down the pasteurizing machine. I was shocked and scared. He was moaning and in pain. We were in trouble, big trouble. Do you think your dad dumped that milk? John had that Carnation Dairy, and he drove milk to Phoenix in this big truck that was Carnation Dairy, and the milk came from the Devosse's Dairy. Late spring was something I looked forward to since it was time for bugs, locusts, or as I found out later, cicadas. They came, announced their arrival, as we all know, with their incessant sound, and Daddy would take me to the swamp next to the dairy to pick the weird exoskeletons off the cottonwood trees. Some of the bugs were starting to emerge. Their wings unfolded, they stretched, and when the entire body popped out, they flew away. The swamp was a wonderland. There were cicadas, pollywogs, tadpoles, and minnows. I filled coffee cans with my treasures and put them in the backyard outside my bedroom window. I'd break small slivers of river willow branches and arrange them in mason jars that I'd position on my chest of drawers so I could lie in bed and watch the iridescent pink glowworms do their thing. Anybody remember the glowworms on the river willows? Just me? Yeah, okay. I can still describe the interior of our little house. The screen door had those curly Q birds I thought were so cute. The living room was carpeted. There was a green sofa with that rough, scratchy, nasty material. Why they ever put that on sofas, I don't know. But we had a red Naugahyde chair and a Firestone hi-fi. Our dining room was a big table, and to the right was the kitchen. Our refrigerator was a Servel butane refrigerator. Anybody remember butane refrigerators? Crazy. I slept in a crib in my parents' room until my sisters moved out. Then I got to move to their room where I had my choice of which Jenny Lynn bed I wanted. Our telephone was on the dining room wall. Our number was 2801. Later, when the population of Arizona grew, the telephone company changed our numbers to Medford 634-2302. Many times, Mom, Pat, and I would go uptown to Harris Drug for a fountain Coke. The cherry Coke was my favorite. It cost a nickel. We were sitting at the counter, and I was swiveling around on the stool and slurping the Coke when the fire alarm blasted from the station around the corner, alerting the townsmen to hurry and get the truck. We watched it as it headed down the hill. Mom exclaimed, "What if it's going to our house?" Well, it was. When we arrived there, people were milling about, dogs barking, men shouting. Smoke came out of the front door, dogs rambled in and out, and finally Bill Crows came over and told us Mom's pressure cooker had exploded. When I saw the damage, there was a huge hole in the ceiling and pinto beans stuck everywhere. I think Mom never used the pressure cooker again. One other situation was when Mom had to go uptown to shop. Dad came home to watch me. It was usually during a baseball game. He would lie in front of the hi-fi and dial in the station. He listened to the Chicago White Sox. In the meantime, I decided to paint the bathroom. The Shinola Oxblood shoe polish was the ticket. Do you remember Shinola? And do you remember it had like a cork top and a cotton dauber on it? Perfect paintbrush to paint the bathroom. Well, my mother went crazy when she came home, and Dad never watched me again. Whenever I played in our side yard that faced the bridge on the Verde, I'd run screaming into the house, shouting, "The Annie goats are coming." If I saw Auntie Vasseur driving her goats to the river, her goats terrified me. I think the fear came from, you remember Grimm's fairy tales about Billy Goat Gruff? I think that really terrified me. Auntie lived somewhere near Tuzigoot in the tailings pond. I hated the tailings pond. If it was a windy day, the air smelled, and it looked yellow outside. If I smell sulfur today, my stomach turns. I get upset and immediately transported back to that time when the tailings pond would blow that over the town. We moved uptown when I was 7. My folks bought Charlie Fairfield's house at 100 Sunset. Charlie was the manager of the smelter and later became my sister Pat's father-in-law. Jack Fairfield married my sister. My nephew, Jason Fairfield, was their son. And let me get back here. Okay. Jack was the manager of the Bank of Arizona on Main Street. Pat was my oldest sister, and she worked at the bank. I guess that is how they met. I don't know. Jack was later transferred to the new branch in Cottonwood. I was told that the artist, Max Ernst, who lived in Sedona, and I don't know if you're familiar with Max Ernst, it's a very well-known, He lived in Sedona, and he approached Jack for a loan. He was going to use his paintings as collateral. Well, unfortunately, Jack didn't know who Max Ernst was at the time, because he was not a real renowned artist at that point. So he was turned down. Later, I learned that the Ernst painting I loved, and believe me, I consumed this painting. Every time Marilee Brilhart and I sat playing chopsticks and do-re-mi on her living room piano, I'd stare in wonderment at the painting that was hanging on the wall behind her piano. As an adult, I was determined to find out more about it. Even when I traveled to Italy and went to the Guggenheim Museum in Venice looking for answers, to clarify, Max was married to Peggy Guggenheim. It was sold from a gallery in Jerome, I think by Bonham's, for $500,000. Oh, yeah. It wasn't until my maternal grandfather, Lou, died in 1960, and Grandma Wombacher came to live with us, and I was older, that I started to get interested in the generations before me. I learned great-grandma Allen was much loved in Clarkdale and was always helping people. However, I had a different impression of her. She took my baby doll and said it was hers. She also made necklaces out of little brass safety pins, and she had them all over. I was like, what is that? Diphtheria was rampant when Grandma Allen was a girl. She said her little brother Harry died from it. Grandma was born in Cherry in 1888, as I said. I'm not sure of the timeline between living in Cherry and marrying Grandpa Wombacher in 1909 and moving to Clarkdale. Grandpa Wombacher was born in Riverside, Iowa in 1884. How and when the family moved to Arizona and settled in Clarkdale, I'm not sure. Grandpa had 13 siblings. His parents were Andrew John Wombacher, born in Germany in 1831, and Mary Ann Scherer, born in 1842 in Alsace, France. The only one I recall was Uncle Lee, and he was 16 years older than my grandpa. Uncle Lee was married to Aunt Claire. They lived on First North and had 4 sons. Dan ran the Texaco, Joe owned the newsstand, also Cherry and Bob. I'm sure many of you remember the Wombacher brothers. You do, Curtis, don't you? Yes, you do. Grandpa also worked at the Ice House in Jerome. And last year, Larry Benotz found his dad, George's collection of stuff. George collected all kinds of stuff. Larry found my grandpa's ice pick from the Jerome Ice Company. It has his name on it, and it's right there. L.C. Wombacher. I mean, it's such a treasure to have that. Because think about it. None of us even knew what the heck an ice box was. We call them ice boxes, but they're refrigerators. But he would deliver and also do the ice. Apparently, there are other stories about Grandpa Lou driving to the top of Mingus to help people stranded and too afraid to drive down the switchbacks through Jerome onto Clarkdale. There used to be quite a few wrecked and rusted out car carcasses where the unfortunate drivers lost their brakes and went crashing off the hill by the Clarkdale Lodge and down into Bitter Creek. Kathy Feld-Mudroon, here she is right there. My lifelong friend and I were walking through the park on our way home after spending the morning at the Clarkdale pool. We could spend the entire day. Summertime for us was the pool, our friends, and awful sunburns. We didn't have sunblock lotion, only zinc oxide that we plastered on our noses. The fee for a day at the pool was 25 cents. We were almost at the bandstand and probably planning our next adventure when we noticed a truck coming down the hill. It was going way too fast. I yelled, "It's gonna crash." The truck hit the concrete pillars on the corner of the park. Then stinky asphalt spurted out all over the top of the tank, and the rear axle of the truck came off and rolled across the grass towards the lodge. The driver was honking the horn and waving at us. I remember his eyes were huge like baseballs. Kat grabbed my hand and pulled me onto the bandstand. Luckily, no one was hurt, but we raced home to tell the story. Kathy and I were always busy riding bikes, skating, swimming, playing ball, hide and seek, and making some awful tasting soup out of whatever we could find in the kitchen. We heard about something really cool we can volunteer after school. Okay. It turned out to be the Ground Observer Corps. This was before the dew line and the radar across the northern part of the US and Canada. You all remember the Russians were coming? I was 9 and Kat was 12. My mother was not pleased, but I was determined. We joined, got our wings and a certificate. We were the youngest people in the United States in the Ground Observer Corps. Kathy and me. You can claim fame to that. And there's our wings. What we would do, and I'll tell you, it was pretty crazy. Our assignment was to watch the sky for planes, identify them, the direction they were flying, the body style, whether they were T-33, B-47, DC-3, the approximate altitude. Then we'd register in the logbook and call Central Station in Yuma and report what we had seen. Mrs. Morgan was the coordinator in Clarkdale. Now, I was trying to figure out what that house was there. It's the house right at the last row of houses right before the park, on that end of the park. And Mike Morris and his mom and them lived there, but right next door to them was where we did the Ground Observer work. You remember that house? Or who lived there? I don't either. Well, anyway, when the mines closed and the miners released their burros, they just let them go. They wandered all around Clarkdale. We named them Blackie, Tommy Dorsey, and Midnight. They were great fun. The poor things, we fed them anything we could sneak out of the house. Bread, cheese, lunch meat, anything. They all liked the treats, though. Sometimes my dad would take the day off, and we would either go to Tapco, to the artesian well, or go mushroom hunting on Mingus. The artesian well was located about a quarter of a mile from the Tapco swinging bridge. It was a long iron pipe, probably a foot in circumference, and emerging horizontally out of the little berm, and extended maybe 20 feet to where the cold water poured. There was an abundance of watercress growing in the crystal clear water. Dad always brought along old copies of the Arizona Republican. Did you know it used to be called the Arizona Republican? Before it was called the Arizona Republic? It was. Anyway, after we cut the watercress, he wrapped the damp paper around the cress and put it in our car. Then we'd fill up the few glass containers we brought for the water and head home. Before we'd leave, I'd stick my head in front of the pipe to get one last gulp. The monsoons usually came in July, and somehow Dad knew when it was time to hunt mushrooms. He loaded our red Fire Chief Pontiac and itchy army blankets, and a jug of water, paper sacks, and a hand towel. Off we went uptown, where we'd stop and buy a loaf of bread, usually Rainbow, a slice of ham from Selna's Butcher, and a Hershey bar. We were set. We were ready to head up to the top of Mingus then, and we would arrive at the Upper Potato Patch campground. We picked out the place to set up. Dad always cautioned me to stay close, since I was so damn curious. I think he worried that I would get lost, or maybe get a bad mushroom. Well, I wanted to find the most Russians, so I was always in competition with him. Surprised when I looked back once and he was gone. I didn't see him anywhere. All of a sudden he popped out from behind a pine tree and said, "See, I told you, you need to follow me and pay attention where the trail is, otherwise you're never going to find your way home." One of the best lessons my father ever taught me. Because I can go anywhere now. Remember where I was. Remember how to get back. Don't use GPS. That was like an internal GPS at the time. My dad was a good storyteller. He talked a lot about his childhood in San Marcos, Texas, and how he and his older brother Joe would hunt squirrels, raccoons, and rabbits. I thought hunting and eating those creatures was awful. I'm reminded of the noxious smell coming from the biology lab at Mingus Union. Squirrels and frogs boiled in pots, removing the skin and meat so we could mount the bones. Ugh. We also dissected cow's eyes. The stink was sickening. And Mr. Ryan, my biology teacher, married to my Aunt Francie, you remember walking across from the main building and you could smell that horrible smell? Those of you who went to Mingus Union on the Hill? It was terrible. Anyway, getting back to where I was without losing my place, Mr. Conley was also related to me. He was the shop teacher, and he was married to my Uncle Ray's daughter, Joanne Allen. Uncle Ray and Aunt Dorothy eventually moved to Bridgeport. Besides Joan, they had a daughter, Sue, and a son, Billy. My dad told me he played handball with LBJ. Maybe, I really don't know, but I don't know why you'd make that up. Apparently, he was a renowned baseball player in Clarkdale. My dad, not LBJ. I heard he was offered to try out for the Chicago White Sox. And that's Dad, the taller guy. The photo was taken in 1931 at the Jerome Ballpark, and he was standing beside his teammate, Wayne Pintrell. That's a pretty cool old truck, anyway. The information I have about my paternal family, the Starkeys, is very limited, but I've discovered some of it through Ancestry Online. Memories of the Starkeys were told by Dad and his siblings, Aunt Billy, Louise, Ann, and Uncle Joe. The paternal family history is long. Their generations in the country began in New England. Then they migrated South Carolina, Alabama, and Texas. Then eventually they moved to our family ranch in Cherry Creek. Today I'm the only member of my dad, Ed Starkey's immediate family. Grandma and Grandpa were 92 and 90 when they were moved to the Pioneers' home in Prescott. Grandpa died in 1967, Grandma in 1970. They celebrated their 60th wedding anniversary when I was 7 years old. The ranch in Cherry was quite simple. No electricity, only kerosene lamps. There was no running water. So Grandma walked to Cherry Creek every morning carrying a heavy galvanized bucket to fill that day for the drinking water and also used for cooking. She carried it up the path to the house. Then she'd sit it on a three-legged stool next to the refrigerator. There was an enamel ladle next to the bucket, and I loved scooping and slurping. But if Grandma caught me, she'd scold me and say, "Use a glass, it's unsanitary to drink out of the ladle." Years before I arrived on the scene, my sisters told me about the cow my grandparents had. Pat said Grandma milked the cow named Bessie and would squirt milk into their mouths. Grandma was an amazing woman. She was fearless. Stories were she stomped a rattlesnake to death. She collected manzanita, made lamps. She recycled everything, made beautiful quilts, canned fruit, vegetables from the orchard across the street that they had. And I heard that if you had a garden during World War II, the government would give you extra sugar. Most of the food was rationed then. However, Grandma had a beautiful garden, and she grew most of their food. Her clothes were plain, a gingham dress usually, apron, heavy stockings, and a sunbonnet. That's Grandma when she was young, and that's Grandma with her gray hair and her strawberry blonde braid. And this was at our house at 100 Sunset, and the Tappan Range in the background. Okay, get back to where I was. Her clothes were plain, and I already covered that one. Her long strawberry blonde hair was turning gray except for 6 inches. That was her original color. Her braid was long, almost to her waist. After she brushed it the 100 strokes, she twisted it and put it in a bun on top of her head. She was my hero. The toilet they had was a typical outhouse. The door even had a crescent moon on it, and I used yellow paint and painted stars too. I had many fantasies sitting on the wooden seat, feet dangling since I couldn't reach the floor. The smell was horrible, but it didn't stop me from spending time in that stinky place. There was a bucket full of lye with a big enamel spoon used to sprinkle on the nasty, and there were a lot of old catalogs and magazines. Grandpa was strange. He whistled an unrecognizable tune, wore baggy denim jeans and a plaid shirt, and sometimes wore a faded bandana on his bald head. He also had that weird, musty old man smell. Years later, when they finally got electricity, he would sit by the radio for hours, listening to news or whatever. I didn't notice since I was so busy outside playing. It just seemed he was always sitting in that chair. And he had lost fingers, so it was kind of weird. You know, when a kid was like, ugh. And he'd hand me a piece of Hershey candy. He had these big chocolate Hershey bars. Remember? He'd break off a piece and he'd hand it to you, and it was kind of already starting to melt. My mom would get so mad at me, she'd give me the evil eye. Don't take that, Grandma. It's not good for you. But anyway, Grandpa came from Alabama, and he came from a very wealthy family. In fact, they used to say that he was a dandy, whatever the heck that meant. They even lived on a plantation, but they lost everything in the Civil War. They migrated to Texas, where they owned a mercantile, and they lost that too when the credit they'd given to men on the cattle drives weren't repaid. Grandpa's folks were Thomas Jefferson Starkey, born in 1854 in Jackson, Alabama, and Heather Mahaley Cunningham, born in 1856 somewhere in Tennessee. Grandma was born in San Marcos, Texas in 1887. Her name was Emma Vogelsang. Her parents were Gustav and Mary. She had a brother, Gus, and Ida. They died before I was born. I was my dad's sidekick. I loved going in his Chevy dump truck, riding in the Caterpillar tractor, and sliding down the piles of sand and gravel at his crusher. His crusher was right close to the Milwaukee Hotel, in that area right down there. There's no remnants or anything of it now, so you don't see it. So you'd only know if you'd lived here at that time and seen where it was. He let me throw rocks, and I'd go home with piles of sand in my fanny. My mother'd throw me in the bathtub, and the sand would be all over the bottom of the tub. Dad let me throw rocks. Mom didn't think that was very nice behavior for a young woman. I climbed trees, wearing dresses, kicked rocks, and I was definitely a tomboy. The Wombacher side of the family is more familiar since they'd been in the valley for decades. I mentioned earlier that my great-grandmother Kate and her parents came here from Illinois. The 6 generations born in Arizona started with my grandmother, Anna Josephine's birth in Cherry. I want to kind of go off script a bit. When I say 6 generations, I mean you had to be born here in the Verde Valley or Cherry or whatever. And we have that in our family. Because with my great-grandma, my grandma, my mom, my sister's son, which would be you, but Jeff and Lou, their sons had sons, and their sons had a son. So we could actually be 7 generations, which is pretty remarkable in Arizona. See, I've been told that there were 14 generations of my maternal family born in the United States. I just know the ones that I studied and were born in the Verde Valley. The Allens I spoke about earlier were the original settlers in my family's heritage to arrive in Camp Verde. This was the territory in 1876. My great-grandparents were George and Nancy Sessions, followed by my great-grandparents William, Riley, Allen, and Kate Sessions. My maternal grandmother, Anna Josephine Allen, was born in Cherry in 1888, and Louis Cyril Wombacher was born in 1884. They were married in Prescott in 1909. Mom and Aunt Marie were their only children, and as I remember, Grandma and Grandpa adopted Aunt Marie's children when she died. My dear grandparents were the glue of the family. Every Sunday after Mass at St. Cecilia's, Grandma and Grandpa would drive to each family member's house in his 1950 green 2-tone Chevy sedan. Grandma in her Sunday dress and hat, and Grandpa in his starched tan khaki pants and Stetson hat. He always opened the car door for her, and she'd hold onto his arm as they walked up the sidewalk to our front door. Grandma was legally blind, even though she could see shadows and outlines and colors. She was able to navigate our house and play solitaire with large cards and do most personal things for herself. It amazes me how humble she was. She never complained, and I'm not sure how she lost her sight. It must have been when I was very young. When we moved uptown to 100 Sunset, I was thrilled. There were sidewalks to ride my bike and skate. I always got flat tires in Lower Town because there were so many goat head stickers. They'd puncture my tires, and that would be the end of it. The sidewalks were great for skating up here. Shoe skates attached to my saddle oxfords with clamps, and I used a skate key to tighten them. I zoomed all over Clarkdale in my first outing. It was great. And I'd go down the hill by the DeVault's house. Remember Valley and Tamara, the hill? I'd stand at the top of that hill, and it's not even a hill anymore. Really, it wasn't a hill then. Next to the DeVault's and the Kings. My heart would pound as I stood looking over the precipice trying to build enough courage. I breathed a sigh of relief when I made it down the hill, going past the Garcias, the Blounts, the Wrights' houses. The Wrights' grandparents had a parrot in a cage in their yard, and as I cruised by, it would start calling out, "Hey, hey, hey, you son of a bitch!" If I made it down the hill without skates coming off, I knew it'd be a good day. However, if I hadn't fastened the clamps tight enough, inevitably I would fall. Falls were very painful. My knees and my elbows and my wrists were often bloody and scabbed from the accidents. If the wound wasn't bad, I wouldn't go home. I knew Mom would clean it and put merthiolate or mercurochrome on it, and I'd rather suffer than have that stuff. There was a gully down the hill in front of Dr. Ray Peckrich's, where I built forts, played cowboys and Indians, and spent time pretending to be Annie Oakley. There were mesquite trees with those big yellow beans I'd suck on, pretending the beans were my food. During this time, my sister Jane was attending Arizona State. She took a science class with a Dr. Starkey, an entomologist, and she volunteered to bring scorpions to class to study and help Dr. Starkey in his poisonous animal research lab. They were making anti-venom. The gully was where I spent time, and it was my laboratory, hunting for scorpions. Mom saved baby food jars, and they became prison for the creatures. Each time Jane came home, I'd send a box back with her. Jane was cool. She managed a theater in Clarkdale, was a telephone operator in Jerome, and then she went to ASU. I remember the time she brought 3 men home with her. They were pilots in training at Williams Air Force Base. One guy, Les, said he'd take me flying. Well, that never happened. But I did get to fly when local pilots held the penny-a-pound flights. Anybody do that? It was great fun. The penny-a-pound flights. They'd take you up, they'd weigh you on their little scale, and that's how much you pay to go. And we'd fly around the Verde Valley. The first time I went with the Quisenberries, friends of my parents who lived in the houses at the Clemenceau Airport. I assume those are still there. Those houses still there by the Clemenceau Airport? Mom was not thrilled and told me never to do that again. Well, the next time I snuck out, and guess what? I did it again. My dream was to become a fighter pilot. They didn't let women do that then, so I married one. Where is he? He's here somewhere. I saw him. Oh, there he is, right there. Anyway, we grew up, went to Mingus Union together. Gary went to ASU. We went to ASU, lived in Tempe. He went to Williams Air Force Base, and he became a pilot, and I kind of followed in his footsteps. Never became a pilot, but I crashed one of the KC-135s that he was training in at Castle Air Force Base in California. I didn't crash the plane, I crashed the simulator. I think it was in Gilroy, wasn't it? Yeah, Gilroy. Anybody knows where Gilroy, California is? Anyway, getting back online here. I can get off real easy. Terry Quisenberry was 2 years older than me, and I really liked playing with her. She called one night and said we should come to their house and watch Ed Sullivan, since Elvis was going to be on Ed Sullivan. We didn't have a TV. It wasn't until I was in the 8th grade that we had a TV. The only TV I could watch was with a neighbor or grandparents. My grandparents' TV screen was tiny, about the size of a basketball. Grandma would sit in her chair and listen to As the World Turns and Search for Tomorrow, her favorite soap operas. Mom didn't like Elvis. In fact, when he was filming a movie in Sedona, he called around to see if any of the liquor stores in Cottonwood or Clarkdale carried Krug champagne. The only place he could buy it was from my parents when they owned the Clarkdale newsstand. I don't understand her disdain for him, but according to Dad, she was quite rude and corrected his pronunciation of Krug. Apparently, she thought it should be pronounced Crew. When I found out, I thought, damn, she could have even gotten his autograph. Why not? Elvis. When we moved uptown, Dad and the Clarkdale Sand and Gravel plant, and I don't know, first when he sold it or when he bought it, but he worked for Standard Oil below the tracks. And the tracks I noticed yesterday are gone. There's no more tracks down there. Well, when they took those out. Wallace Hancock was the manager of the Standard Oil plant, and Dad and he became friends, and he hired Dad. I liked Wallace. He was kind. I'm mentioning names of people who may not be well known or have great histories here, but they were all residents of Clarkdale. When Dad started his own business, he hired Joe Franquero. Joe delivered sand and gravel all over the valley, and sometimes he'd go to Prescott. The tractor they used up the river to dig out the materials, this is bugging me. Is it bugging you? It's not bugging you? The feedback from the pop, 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 pop? Anyway, okay. The tractor that used up the river to dig out the materials was vital to keep his business going. There were big thunderstorms upriver near Sigbor, and Dad had to get up in the middle of the night, race up the river, and move the machine, fearing it would be washed away. During one of his excavations, he uncovered a native burial grave. The remnants were shell bracelets still around the arm bones and a few pot shards. The park ranger from Tuzagood examined the site and took the artifacts. They were on exhibition for years. I don't know if they still are, though. I was in high school when Dad was doing reclamation at the smelter. The story I was told was that he was quite high, 90 feet up. When the board he was standing on broke, it had previously been burned underneath, and it wasn't visible to him. I was at Kathy's when someone called to tell me about the accident. He must have been living a clean life because he had 9 lives. You don't fall 90 feet and survive. Anyway, his liver was torn, a few broken vertebrae, and there were some other minor injuries. There were other life-threatening issues in the time. When my brother, when he was 3 years old, rode his tricycle off the Verde Bridge into the river and nearly died. I too had a bad accident. When I was playing chase with Charlene Blount at their house, we were racing through the yard, and I was trying to catch her. I followed her onto the front porch. She ran inside, slamming the door. I put my arm out to stop the door, but the glass broke, and the jagged edges cut through my right wrist. Blood shot out like a fountain. I was terrified and probably in shock. When I ran into the street, lucky for me, Mr. McMillan, the delivery driver for Riley's Dry Cleaning. Anybody remember them? He was coming down the street, stopped, took off his belt, and made a tourniquet. Someone went to my sister Pat's just across the street. She called Mom, and they raced me to Marcus Lawrence Hospital in Cottonwood. Dr. Ken Brillhart and his nurse, Maddie Lyle, were already waiting. The bright lights in the operating room were blinding. A nurse tried to comfort me by showing me a Mickey Mouse mask and said, "Don't be afraid. We'll put this on your nose, then take a deep breath, and you'll fall asleep. And when you wake up, you'll be all fixed." Well, I found out after I woke up it was ether and a few pukes later. It was horrible. I wish I could have told Mr. McMillan he saved my life. The McMillans lived in Jerome, and Mrs. McMillan was well known for her crazy driving on sidewalks. Right? Seriously. If you saw her coming, you got out of the way. It was, yeah, you're right. See, we have all these connections. Anyway, she would back into cars, run over signs. I mean, it was just crazy. We knew when she came to town, we'd stay out of her way. Clarkdale was a great place to grow up. Not only did we have freedom to run and play, but everyone knew whose kid you were. If I did something I shouldn't, inevitably someone saw me and called Mom. Mom was the disciplinarian. I believe to this day that the adage, "It takes a village to raise a kid," was true in Clarkdale. Going to town was always a treat. Selna's grocery store was not only for food shopping, but it was a hub for seeing people and catching up on whatever was going on in town. Selna's had everything we needed, or at least we thought they did. Mom would make a list and send me to the store. She didn't like shopping. I loved it. The aisles were nothing like today's. They have everything now. But it was still fun. I liked it. I remember the butcher, Carl Hance. He'd say to me, "Well, Mary Evelyn, what's it going to be today?" The selection of beef was astounding. There was top round, bottom round, sirloin, ground beef, all sorts of steaks, roasts, even liver. We ate a lot of ground beef and round steak. When Dad's business was slow, he'd barter with Selna's for pinto beans, bacon, or staples that would get us through the rough patch. In lieu, Dad would take the Caterpillar tractor to Cottonwood, grade the store's parking lot filled with potholes, and put down new gravel. I think bartering was a rather widespread practice then. I looked forward to going to Selna's grocery store. I still like grocery shopping. There are so many cool things to see. Do you remember Ipana toothpaste? Bucky Beaver? Their mascot and slogan, "Brush it, brush it, brush it," with the new Ipana? Clover Club potato chips? Wholesome bread? Borden milk and Elsie the cow? Milk Nickel ice cream bars? And when I was talking to Fred Muldoon about the Texaco station, he reminded me of the Texaco motto, and it was always, you can trust your car to Texaco, the man who wears the star. Dan wore his uniform, his green Texaco uniform, with Texaco on it every day. He was impeccably dressed, greeted everybody. It was great. Across the main street, where Dan Wombacher, Uncle Lee's son, ran the Texaco. Many of you remember his son was Jerry Wombacher. He was Dan and Virginia's son, and my grandpa's nephew. Dan looked professional in his smart green Texaco uniform. I liked him. He was a nice man. Always smiling. Dan always smiled. Quite a few of the high school boys hung out at the station. I remember Bruce Van Kirk, Charlie Bonaha, my brother Lou, Buff Randall, and George Nelson. George was murdered in Sedona. He was shot in the head as the car approached the Rainbow's Inn bar. The story was George got in the back seat. He wasn't supposed to. Rumors were that the intended target switched seats with George. The weapon and killer were never found. There were speculations, but none was ever proven. Anybody ever know any more about what happened? I never knew any more. The Texaco station was full service, which meant everything was checked. Tires, under the hood, windows washed, you name it. since there was only one station that took care of all of our auto needs. There was, however, a Union 76 station built at the bottom of Miller's Hill. That's what that was. It was built down there, right? They tore it down, it's not there anymore. I saved pennies and nickels to buy candy and bubble gum from that place. Our neighbor, Don Downs, was the manager. The Downs lived across the street from us on Sunset. They had 3 daughters, Debbie, Polly, and Abby. I thought it was cool they were all born on a holiday. Deb Christmas, Polly the 4th of July, and Abby St. Patrick's Day. Their dad, Don, lost his arm in World War II. He was the first person I'd seen or knew who was severely injured in the war. Looking back, there was very little discussion about the war. Dad wanted to serve, and he tested for the Army Air Corps to be a pilot, but was rejected because he was colorblind. Uncle Joe, Dad's older brother, was a Seabee. Sometimes he spoke about his time in the Pacific building and repairing airfields. Dad told a story. Now, I would like to get this verified if anybody knows this. Dad told me a story about Japanese men camping uptown prior to Pearl Harbor. He said they camped in a tent near the houses on First North that looks over to where the smelter is. And, see, I could not confirm this, but I don't think my dad would make up a story like that. And I don't know why he would say it. My impression of the war and the, make sure I don't get ahead of myself. My impression of the war and the Depression was of events I didn't comprehend. I was too young. However, Pat said everyone suffered during the Depression. Hearing their stories, I hope I never experience. She said rationing of everything was the norm. I recall her telling me she couldn't get shoes her size and had to wear men's shoes. Maybe the reason people didn't talk about the war was it affected so many negatively that they wanted to move on, celebrate, and appreciate life. Saturday mornings in Clarkdale were special. Rosie from Centerville would soon be rounding the park and ready to sell her Mexican food from the trunk of her two-tone green and white 68 Chevy Bel Air. Rosie was barely 5 feet. In fact, I doubt she was that tall. She was petite and had to sit on 2 pillows to reach the steering wheel. She always wore the same apron with big pockets. I'd try to arrive early, otherwise everything would be sold. Right? She parked in front of Viva Sprague's beauty salon. She would open her trunk and start taking orders. Her chicken tacos were the best. They're the best I've ever eaten, and they're the only tacos I've ever eaten that had a dill pickle on them. Anybody remember that one? Really good. Her food was wonderful. If the tacos were sold, I'd get a bean and cheese burro. We didn't call them burritos like today. They were burros. Rosie's food was delicious. Everyone knew they better get there early because it always sold out. The only restaurant in Clarkdale before Norma Wombacher opened, the Snowcap, was the Black Hills. The Condon family ran it when I was young. I would beg Mom to take Grandma and me to breakfast after Mass. The Condon family lived 4 doors down from us. They had 2 daughters, Patty and Sandy, and Johnny. My brother dated Patty. I've heard they now live in Sedona. If we wanted to eat out, we went to Cottonwood to Ning Sing Tom. He made special Chinese chicken noodle soup for me. Or we would go to either Amigos Inn or Bueno's. When Viva Sprague opened her beauty salon in the 1960s, Linda, her daughter, classmate, and cousin, brought a Ouija board for us to play. We were typical teen girls, wanting to find out if any of the boys liked us, when we would get married, how many kids we'd have. Mom was old school, and she thought we were going to go to hell if we played the Ouija board. The drugstore was next to the beauty salon, and when it became a Rexall, Kathy and I spent a lot of time with cosmetics and hair care products. We were lucky because Mom's best friend, Dot Potticky, worked there, and she let us try anything we wanted. When the store finally closed, I think in the 60s, she let us pick out whatever we wanted. We'd load up with Q-Tex, Revlon, Tangy lipsticks, Coty makeup, Fabergé cologne, Tampax, and Breck shampoo. I'll never forget that day. It was better than Christmas. Andrea Alice Bradley Potticky was born in 1901 in California. Her family moved to Cherry Creek, Arizona when she was a toddler. She married a man who was a ship's captain for the presidential steamship lines. His work sent them to China and Japan in the 1920s. Now, there's a sidebar. Where are you? Lives in that house now. Did she leave? City council person? Oh, there you are. She lives in that house. Laura? Right? Okay. Dot was my mom's best friend. Dot would go to town every morning except Sunday to pick up her mail. She always stopped by our house on her way home. Often I'd see her drive up and park her 1952 green Pontiac in the same place, get out, walk up to the front gate, open the gate, go up the sidewalk to the front door, and she was a smart dresser. Her attire was impeccable, and I always was curious to see what she was wearing. I wondered how many Pendleton suits she had. They were all either a shade of red or pink. Dot was a petite woman too, maybe size 6, and her auburn hair was perfectly coiffed. I was impressed by her style. That's Dot. Mom and Dot would sit in their living room for hours chatting and gossiping. They smoked Marlboros and Winston Lights and sipped on coffee. It was fun spying on their conversations. When Dot returned from China, she divorced the captain and married Al Potake. I believe he was the manager and accountant at the smelter. Kathy tells me about the time Dot took her to the vacant homes of many of the higher-ranking, wealthier people up in Jerome who left when the mines closed. Dot coveted the crystal doorknobs, wood floors, and other embellishments that remained. Since Al, her husband, was in charge, she got to take whatever she wanted. When Dot died in 1979, she left her house on 3rd South to my parents. They lived there until their deaths in 97 and 99. I don't recall when Dad sold the Sand and Gravel Company or why, but my folks managed the Verde Valley Country Club for years. They lived in the little house next to the clubhouse. Then I believe in 1967, the club was moved to the Clark Mansion. When it was moved up the hill overlooking the golf course at Peck's Lake, the bathrooms were enormous, big, huge tubs, and pastel green tiles covered both the floors and the walls. It was obvious to me that at one time this was a very rich person's house. That painting, I don't know if Dee Dee came today, Dee Dee Earl. She lives in Clarkdale now. She's an artist. I had her do that pastel for me of the mansion. And I think that was after the fire was there, maybe. But I do have that, and I didn't know if the Historical Society would want that. But if they do like to have it, I'd be happy to give it to them. When I was quite young, I remember my parents getting dressed in party attire and going to New Year's celebrations at the original clubhouse. Dinah Moore Gimel talked about her mom and dad, Petey and Perry Moore, playing at the dances. Mom and Dad always brought the party favors, hats, whistles, streamers home for me. My grandmother told me about the wonderful dances held at the pavilion by the lake. The pavilion was wonderful. It's too bad it had to go away. It was an interesting place, built in the round, wood floors and windows that had shutters that opened upward, and attached to the side of the building there was a large front door and sconces on the outside walls that lit up at night. Grandma said it was a marvelous place to dance. I wish all these historical buildings had been saved. Wouldn't it be great if we had a video to experience the grandeur of life in those early years? The building we're in now is a place where many events took place. During my childhood, there were national assemblies. I think they traveled all over the country with various exhibitions. The ones I recall were of the different marine animals and glass jars, and there was a huge octopus that looked like a big pink piece of bubble gum hanging on a chain. And the presenter lifted this creature out of this container. It was a wolf eel, and it was undoubtedly the scariest thing I'd ever seen. There was a rattlesnake wrangler who brought snakes and gunny sacks and showed us how to... Were you there? Did you remember him? The rattlesnake wrangler? Anybody remember him besides Kathy and me? Anyway, he would bring his rattlesnakes and gunny sacks, and he'd milk the rattlesnakes and ask us if we wanted to pet the rattlesnakes on their head. She did. I didn't. In March, the Catholic Church, right there, this place, celebrated St. Patrick's Day. When I was 11, I got to be the person who managed the fish pond. Kids were given bamboo poles with strings and clothespins attached, and cost them a nickel to get their first cast. I collected their money and went behind the screen that would be decorated to look like a pond full of goldfish. The kids would toss the clothespin over the top, eagerly awaiting their treasure. I'd attach a little brown paper sack to each clothespin and toss it back over. There were other activities at the St. Patrick's celebration, like bingo. Actually, I won a turkey one time. There was a cake walk, and Mom usually baked her famous rainbow cake. It was 4 layers, chocolate, strawberry, vanilla, and white, and she frosted it with that $1 million cooked frosting. I can't substantiate this, but Mom and Grandma told me about the time Tyrone Power came to the St. Pat's celebration. Anybody remember Tyrone Power, the actor? Anyway, he came to the celebration here. He was filming a movie in Sedona, and I looked online to find out what the movie was that he starred in. It turns out that all I could determine was called The Pony Soldier, and it was released in 1952. Mrs. Reynolds was our tap dance teacher and had us perform at the celebration. We'd wait backstage, right back there, until Bing Crosby's version of the Easter Parade started to play. My heart would pound, waiting for the cue. Our pianist was Alice Mickle. She lived in Cottonwood. When my sister Pat couldn't play the organ in church, Mrs. Mickle would come to Clarkdale and fill in. Mingus Junior High held basketball games here too. When I was in the 8th grade, our music teacher, John Dubeck, decided to perform the operetto, The Mikado. That is my actual playbook. John Tavasi was Yum Yum. No, I was Yum Yum, he was Poobah. He was the main character, male character, and I was a female. I wore an authentic kimono Dot Potake brought back from Japan. It was orchid-colored silk with shades of lavender, pale pink, and purple, intricately embroidered peonies, which I still have in my graduation cedar trunk. The cheerleaders at our games were in junior high were Charlene Blount, Janice Benotz, and Susan Kramer. And I'm taking the picture, that's why I'm not in. We're the Mingus Rams, and our colors were green and gold. That's why it's green and gold curtains. I started taking baton lessons in 7th grade. Mr. Dubeck's wife taught us in their backyard. They lived across the street from Jim and Nona Haskins. They're next door to Mrs. Rothenberger, my 4th grade teacher. It's interesting that the street seemed to be the teacher street. Blanche Rail, Miss Ivy, Eloise Turner, Lou Rothenberger, and John Dubeck all lived in those same houses on that street. Mom and my sister Pat were valedictorians of their class. I wasn't interested in school until Mr. Dubeck came. He was hand-downs, my favorite. He was the first band teacher I had, and when it was time to decide what instrument I play, I chose a clarinet. I was 3rd seat. Virginia Blount was 1st, and Susan Kramer 2nd. Mr. Dubeck gave me a 1+ grade for our semester because I chose Chilito Lindo. He said it was much more difficult than either Susan's or Virginia's choices. I can honestly say the years I spent in junior high were really the best. More fun than even high school. We had dances, and I don't recall how often, but they were fun, really fun. Steve Wombacher, my cousin, and I were a team. We fast-danced the bop, or whatever we called it then. We were very competitive. The 2nd floor of the now burned-down school was where the auditorium was located. It was my 7th grade year that we held a talent contest, and John Tavasi was the hint of the show. He lip-synced the song by Brian Hyland in 1960, Itsy Bitsy Teeny Weeny Yellow Polka Dot Bikini. He got a standing ovation. That year the school bought a trampoline and we could never get enough of jumping on it. In 1957 or 58, my brother was sent to Fort Grant. He and his friends got into a fight with some guys from Flagstaff. Lou hit one of the boys from Flag in the head with a 2x4 and was arrested for assault. This was devastating to my mother. He was her pride and joy. This sent her into a downward spiral of depression that lasted for years. I believe few people knew how this affected her. That same year, Pat's husband, Jack, who suffered diabetes, died. Pat came to live with us. She already had 2 young kids, Dodie and Jay. And she was pregnant with John when her husband died. The years between 1957 and 60 were difficult for our family. My grandpa Lou died. Mom and I moved to Prescott to help Pat when she moved back to work at the bank. After a year, I came back to Clarkdale. Grandma Wombacher moved in with us, and our lives were irrevocably changed then. Pat remarried, and her son Mark, who's here too, Mark Wilgus, he went to Mingus Union and ASU, and he now lives in Seattle. Jay lives in Scottsdale. When Clarkdale was bought, I think by the Halliburton Corporation, I'm not sure when. That was when it was incorporated, for sure. Somebody correct me on that if I'm wrong. But I think it was at that time. Dad became a city councilman, and his friend Bud Linder, Curtis's dad, was the mayor. We were somewhat of a political family. By that I mean Grandpa Lou oversaw the polls in Clarkdale. He would get up at 4 a.m. to go to the little building located next to the elementary school to meet the other workers and get ready for the big day. When I was 8, Mom and Dad took me to a Democratic rally in Phoenix for the then presidential candidate, Adlai Stevenson. It was noisy and full of people wearing straw hats with red, white, and blue ribbons. Mom carried on the tradition after Grandpa died. Years later, my sister Pat was on the city council. I think my interest in politics came from the ongoing discussions at our dinner tables about politics. Plus, it was an imperative we voted. I registered in 1966 immediately when I turned 18. My first presidential election was 1968 between Nixon and Humphrey. When President Kennedy was killed, I was in third hour course at Mingus Union on the Hill. Mr. Dubeck was our teacher. Our secretary, either Petey, I can't remember if it was your mom, or Mrs. Franklin came over the PA announcing the horrific news that President Kennedy had been shot. There was a loud gasp in the room, and some of the girls started crying. All I could think of was, oh my God, are we going to go to war? President Kennedy's assassination was probably the most universally tragic event in my life at that time. Let's say other than family deaths, which obviously would have been. But life seemed to change from then on. People were either sad or angry. It felt like the funeral went on for a week. Everyone's TVs were turned on in anticipation of answers as to why and who. Since we were Catholics and he was the first Catholic president, it deeply affected my family. Grandma sat in a rocking chair listening and crying softly and wiping her nose with her little hanky. I was confused and wondered how this could happen. That Sunday in Mass, the priest asked us to be silent for a minute and pray for the country. I think everyone memorized President Kennedy's inauguration address where he said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, rather what you can do for your country." Do any of you remember our cops? Buck Snoddy? Noble Purtle? Virgil Hopper? Anyway, these men were interesting characters, and Buck out of the three was the most colorful. I think their names would have been great crime novels or television series. Kathy Feld was the lifeguard at the Clarkdale pool, and she recalls the day a guy drowned at the dam. Now, she corrected me and told me it was a child, a little boy child. And I thought it was Buck that went and got her, but she said it was somebody in the fire truck came and got her at the pool. And they asked her to come with them. He drove to the area by the dam and told her to get the body. 16 years old. Tied a rope around her waist, told her to dive in and get the body. You think that would happen today? So if you've not seen a picture of Buck, let me describe him for you. He was a big man, a cowboy. He wore boots and jeans and a board-stiff starch white shirt stretched over his belly with its pearl snap buttons ready to pop. Picture the police car he drove. It listed to the driver's side since he probably weighed 300 pounds. I never had an issue with him, and if he saw me, he would tip his hat, raise his finger off the steering wheel, and acknowledge me. I think Virgil Hopper was the least liked by all the kids, and Noble Purtle I don't remember much about other than their names. Finally, high school. I weighed 90 pounds. That's initiation day. We would go paint the J on the mountain. Anyway, it was big time going to high school. I was utterly intimidated by the other classmen, and during the first assembly, my knees shook so uncontrollably I had to press them together to make them stop. Every day, and probably 99% without delay, the school bus pulled around the corner of the park, ready to load the Clarkdale kids and head up the hill. We weren't allowed to drive to school unless we had a doctor or a dentist appointment. We caught the bus by the park in Clarkdale. Mr. Farrell, or Mr. Van Cleef, was our driver. Excuse me, until Losi Rogers came. These drivers were remarkable men. I don't remember any bus accidents, and we always got to school on time. There were a few rare days when snow and ice on 89A slowed our arrival, however. I was a sophomore when Susan Belts was killed. She was driving down from Jerome in her grandfather Carl's red Jeep. It was prom time, and her death was a huge trauma to those of us who were her friends, as well as the entire school. Mom drove Kathy and me to see where the accident happened. I remember feeling sick looking over the guardrail where the upside-down Jeep came to rest. It looked obvious no one could have survived. There were 3 other car accidents resulting in classmates' death: Susan, Bill Ogden, and Eric Stottleman. I think Robert told me one other one, right? There was one other one. Snow in Clarkdale was rare. However, in 1967, that changed. That's it, people. It was during our Christmas break at ASU that Clarkdale got snow measured in feet, and to get out of their houses, people used whatever implement they had: regular dirt shovels, hoes, brooms. Nobody had shovels, snow shovels. Finally, a white Christmas. I-17 was snow-packed at Black Canyon, and the road from I-17 to Cottonwood was closed. If it snowed up on Mingus and there was enough snow covering the hill that the Forest Service had built, one of our parents would take us up to slide. None of us had appropriate winter clothes, maybe gloves and hats. I remember being miserable, freezing wet, but thrilled to be playing in the snow. The area we played in was adjacent to the Mingus Mountain Inn, Many times as Dad had to go to Prescott, we'd stop at the inn and eat. It was a landmark place, and I'm sorry it's gone now. Dad and I went to Prescott to pick my brother Lou's car up, a 1952 Ford Coupe that he and Lou had placed in Prescott customized. It was actually featured in Hot Rod magazine, so I was told. It was dusk as we crossed Lonesome Valley and headed up the mountain. Suddenly, something crashed across the windshield, shattering the glass. Dad pulled off the road. We jumped out to see what had happened. A huge 8-point buck jumped off the rise from the embankment on my side. The deer was dead, and the car was in bad shape, although it was drivable. We were lucky. When we got to the Mingus Mountain Inn, Dad called the wildlife warden to tell him about the deer. My dad always bought used cars, probably from the Lindners, right? He'd always say, let someone else take the depreciation. The first car I remember, I was maybe 2 or 3 years old. It was a 1941 Cadillac convertible. The canvas top was cream, and the bottom was yellowish green. The tires were those big white walls, sidewalls. The steering wheel was ivory colored, and there were all these buttons on the dashboard. There was a small button on the dash that Dad would let me push to get the car started. I decided I was going to drive the car, and one day when he wasn't home, I got in the car and began pushing the button. Well, the car jumped forward each time I pushed. Finally, it gained enough momentum that it rolled into Gundy James' yard, wiping out her bamboo stand. I marched into the house and proudly announced to Mom that I drove the car. She was vacuuming with our Singer upright that she brought from one of the traveling salesmen that came through. The look in her eyes was, she dropped the vac, ran out of the house. When she came back in, she ordered me to get the fuller brush. I knew I'd done something really bad. When we lived in Lower Town, below the tracks, oftentimes traveling salesmen would be making their rounds. I liked the Minnesota Woolen Mills guy. He carried a big case trunk, and Mom would invite him in. It took 2 trips for him back to his car to unload all of his stuff. He would open the trunks and pull out the blankets and lay them over our furniture. It was fun to see the room decorated in colorful blankets. I loved the blankets strewn over the couch and the chairs, and my favorite blanket was a cream-colored one with red, yellow, and green stripes. They were itchy, though, because they were made from wool. When the Watkins salesperson came, he carried one big case, opened in layers, and there were all sorts of flavorings. I still use Watkins products today. The Fuller brush man had every kind of brush, comb, instrument for cleaning, combing hair, even my spanking tool. My brush had an ivory-colored handle with clear bristles. If I did something Mom felt warranted punishment, go get the Fuller brush. The relationship I had with my grandparents, siblings, and friends were probably like most of you here. However, there were other important influences in my life, teachers and church. My family instilled the importance of honesty, truthfulness, kindness, work ethic, and those have all served me well. I've traveled all over the world, met and interviewed presidents and kings, and many renowned people. My brother-in-law, Jack Allen, used to call me Chatterbox because I was always asking questions. One of my catechism teachers called Mom and asked her to tell me to stop asking so many questions. I was scolded, but it didn't stop me. The constant questioning was important of where Mary Evelyn Starkey, a little girl born in Jerome, Arizona and raised in Clarkdale, would go. Print media, radio, television, and literary writing. I didn't have a lifelong desire to end up in radio. Remember, I wanted to be a fighter pilot. Things just happened, and when an opportunity came my way, I jumped in. This trait was handed down by the courageous people who came before me. The struggles they must have endured coming to the United States, and those who came west were of strong, determined stock. Maybe persistence and stubbornness should have been included. So it's not surprising when I was asked to do this, I jumped right in and said, I'm going to go on this adventure. At times I get frustrated that I hadn't listened, that I didn't pay better attention to the stories told by my family, especially my sister Pat. When she died on Valentine's Day 2 years ago, she was my go-to for everything. She knew more than I did because she was 15 years older than me. I realized that much of my history would be lost if I didn't share it. In retrospect, I hope more of you will realize we all have stories and histories. Where to start is the hardest part. But that is what you must do, just start. No matter how silly you might think it sounds, or no one will care. Well, I ask you, why are you here listening to my stories then? Because you're curious. You want to know what life was like in Clarkdale, in the Verde Valley. I think you're here because you subconsciously relate and you hope to hear something about yourself, maybe what we're looking into, or something that reminds us about your experience, or answer questions to who you were or what was before. We relate, we care, we are curious. That's the end of my little chronological history of my family. These were like afterthought pictures that went in after. This is the Starkey family, and my dad's holding my brother, and my sisters are in there, and all of those people in the Starkey family. They're all gone now, everybody. There's nobody in that picture today that is still living. And then if we go to the next one, Fred, this is me when I was born. Now the point was to show you how much it cost me to be born. My mother was in the hospital 10 days. And I believe that the amount was $76 for 10 days. Dr. Jolly was the doctor. His bill was $50. So, 78 years ago, that's what it cost to have a baby. And I'm sure that any of you that were born here, your parents probably experienced the same thing. Dinah, were you born in Clarkdale? See, we all have stories. I mean, we're so interconnected with things that, if we sit down and take the time to share those things with one another, there's a lot of fascinating things, and everybody has a story. I encourage every one of you to start thinking about those things, because once they're gone, and I'm the last one left, nobody knows those things. And this is pretty interesting stuff. Anybody have any questions about anything they saw? Want to know about anything? Correct me on anything I said? That's good enough? Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate it. Everybody that came, this is wonderful. And it's lovely seeing all your faces, especially my old classmates. And they are old now. And that's at my parents' 50th wedding anniversary at the Elks Lodge. So anyway, Fine, termina, no más, nunca. That's it. Thank you.